Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video as we dive into part 3 of Extra History's series on Japanese militarism. If you did not see the first 2 episodes of my reaction, there's a link in the description that will take you back to the beginning, as well as the link to the original content. Highly recommend that you support Extra History. Fantastic stuff that covers the breadth of history, going all the way back to ancient times, all the way up to more recent times. So check it out. Let's go ahead and dive into part 3.
Manchuria, June 4th, 1928, 5:20 a.m. A train speeds through the darkness in the last few minutes before the dawn. Inside sits Chinese warlord Chang, a former bandit. He is master of Manchuria, and until last month, the dictator of the Republic of China. But he's running now, ousted when the nationalist generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his northern expansion forced him out of the capital. Humbled, he returns to the territory he squeezed to financial collapse, intent on fulfilling his dream of holding Beijing. For the first time in months, Chang is safe. His men guard this railway, apart from the portion where it crosses the Southern Manchurian Railroad, controlled by his ally Japan. And he can see the crossing bridge quickly approaching. Soon he'll be in his capital and plotting his comeback. An explosion on the tracks rips the train car nearly in half. 2 of Chang's generals die in front of him, and he himself is mortally wounded. The grisly work of a bomb planted by his allies in the Japanese army.
So my first thoughts about this are, well, why in the world would that happen? I don't know what the answer is because I don't know this part of history. I'm learning this along with you guys, but I sense that Japan sees an opening here, right? What's the best time to invade an enemy? When the enemy is busy fighting amongst themselves, right? So I'm guessing Japan from the outside looking in is thinking, this is our opportunity, let's cause chaos. And while there's chaos, we can jump in and take it all.
Thanks so much to Ting Mobile for helping this historic tale come through loud and clear. Now, you might have noticed for a series on Japanese militarism, so far we've mostly talked about civilian politics. And there's a good reason for that. Because to understand how the tail started to wag the dog in Japanese government, we first have to really understand the dog. And while we spent last episode talking about political parties and factionalism, today we're going to be talking about more factionalism. Because every organization we discuss in this series, the military included, was just a Russian doll of factions. For example, the Japanese Army and Navy had fundamentally different versions of territorial expansion. The Navy wanted to expand south into China and Southeast Asia as a way to counter a possible naval war with the United States.
And that continues into World War II, right? I mean, during World War II, you have this ongoing rivalry and competition for resources between the Navy and the Army.
While the Army, by contrast, thought the key was to dominate Manchuria, which would give it a buffer against both the Soviet Union and the increasingly unified China, and allow Japan to directly extract natural resources it otherwise had to gain through foreign trade. But even within the army, there were also factions. For instance, a radical group known as the Imperial Way faction, mostly made up of junior officers like lieutenants, captains, and colonels from the countryside, preached an abolishment of civilian government and a restoration of the emperor as the sole political power.
And I'm guessing that however complicated this seems to us in this video, the reality is probably even more complicated.
They wanted Japan to go back to the period of its glory, with a revered emperor and loyal samurai, and without the corruptions of party politics, big corporations, industrialization, and commercialism. Now, if you've seen our other series on the Sengoku Jidai and the end of the samurai, you realize this period never really existed. They were hearkening back to an imaginary past.
You know, that happens in history too, right? We talk about a time that once was and wanting to go back to it, and if you talked to the people who were in that time, they would say, well, it wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and it wasn't exactly the way you think of it. As time passes, we tend to forget the negative and focus on the positive, right? So people talk about, man, I wish we could go back to 2 generations ago. Things were so different. But that's because we're only remembering the good stuff of what was different, not all the negatives that go along with it. Probably the same thing happening here.
Their rivals were the Control faction, who wanted to work within the current system, but like the Imperial Way, also saw military expansion into Manchuria and China as the solution to Japan's economic, political, trade, and population difficulties. But they also believed in more modernization and industry than the Imperial Way did, and largely strived to get Japan in a position to preemptively strike and defeat the Soviet Union. But both of these factions detested civilian government, which they saw as westernized, corrupt, and beholden to the zaibatsu, the large corporations that backed parties and candidates. However,
sound familiar at all? Oh man, that government's just beholden to the corporations, to the rich, to the wealthy, to the powerful, versus the military-industrial complex. So in this case, just the military, because they see the industrial part as bad too.
However, it should be noted that the Control faction also believed the zaibatsu were a key ingredient in Japan's war machine. Of these groups, a small sub-faction believed that if they could force an international crisis and get the military into combat, then they could take the reins away from the civilian leaders.
Boy, parallels all over the place here, right? Force an international crisis. He mentioned earlier the whole wag the dog thing, right? If you can get everybody focused on an external enemy, it helps unite the internal. Or you just prove to them, listen, this is why we need a powerful military. This is why the military needs to run the show. Look at this military problem that we need to solve. Hitler does the same thing in Germany, right? You have the Reichstag fire started by those terrible communists and those Jews, and we need to take them down. I probably just demonetized this video, by the way. Or when they invade Poland, right? They manufacture a crisis and they say that Poland did something and now we're just retaliating.
This, they believed, would serve both country and emperor. And most of those plots centered on an area that was then called Manchuria. A term we're going to use for clarity's sake, but just know that name has some baggage attached to it that we'll definitely discuss in our Lies episode. Anyway, in 1905, one of the spoils Japan had acquired during the Russo-Japanese War was the South Manchuria Railway, cutting through northeastern China. Control of this railway had given Japan access to the many raw materials it needed to import from China and Mongolia, and the corridor around the rails had been developed heavily by the zaibatsu, with factories and towns for Japanese workers. Plus, a large Japanese force, the Kwantung Army, guarded these interests against Chinese warlords and local bandits. But the militarist factions wanted more. They wanted all of Manchuria, which is where Chang comes in. See, the Kwantung Army wanted to split governance of Manchuria with him, but he seemed poised to either open Manchuria to trade with the US and Britain, or else lose control to the Russian-backed Chang, who might set up a Soviet puppet state. So, a group of junior officers decided to assassinate him and either install a more competent warlord or provoke a full Japanese invasion and take direct control. But the plot backfired. They never told their senior officers about it, and the Kwantung Army simply wasn't ready to invade. Plus, when it leaked that the Japanese army officers had planted the bomb, the civilian government was furious, and Japan's image tarnished on the world stage.
Now, we saw in an earlier episode how they took the approach that calmed tensions rather than increased them. Obviously, I think in this case that doesn't happen, right? I mean, what would have been the calm thing to do? Deal with the assassins publicly and harshly, and show that this was not something supported by the Japanese government. This is not something the Japanese government wanted. And to prove that, we're going to deal with them, and we're going to be very open in the process. Or you can brush it under the rug. You can kind of say you're sorry and not deal with it. Or you can just outright double down on it. So I know they didn't do the first one. I'll be interested to see how this went.
Then Chang's son came to power, and in retaliation, handed Manchuria to Chang. The military, for their part, stonewalled the Prime Minister's investigation into the explosion. And when the Prime Minister reported this to Emperor Hirohito, a few careless, displeased words from the monarch meant it was the Prime Minister who ended up resigning. The Kwantung Army had, essentially, proved it could act unilaterally and without approval or oversight of the civilian government, and suffer zero consequences.
There you go. And so now if you're the military and you see that on a small scale you got away with this, and it ended up causing the civilian leadership to have to resign, and basically the emperor was like, or just actively supported you, that's a blank check, right? Now we can do whatever we want. Now let's push this. Let's see how far we can go with it.
And to Hirohito, who had not actually wanted the Prime Minister to resign, it was a sign that he shouldn't insert himself into politics. Meanwhile, the economy took a dive. Japan had barely clawed its way out of financial panic when the Great Depression laid it low. The country survived on agricultural and textile exports, particularly silks, and now prices for those goods fell dramatically. So to keep in business, factories tried to make up for this by producing more, leading to an oversupply problem, all while families starved in the countryside. The Liberal Party in power, the Minseto, took deep political damage as well. A successor of the Kensekai, their financial policies only worsened the situation.
So we've got a perfect storm happening here now. We've got economic trouble, which economic trouble we've seen throughout history often leads to people being desperate. And when people are desperate, they'll trust anybody who's offering a solution. We see that in Germany in the 1930s. We also have the combination of not only the economic issues and desperation, but also a military that has found out it's got a blank check to get away with things.
This in turn radicalized large segments of the population who, primed by school curriculums and military service, bought into arguments that civilian government had failed and been corrupted by the Zaibatsu. The military, voters increasingly thought, was Japan's last pure institution. The Minseto became a further target of rage due to its foreign policy. They backed diplomatic engagement with the United States, which had just banned all Asian immigrants angering the Japanese public, along with non-engagement in China. They also cut military budgets. But the last straw was the signing of the London Naval Treaty of 1930, which the Navy claimed undermined Japan's maritime defense and usurped the Emperor's power as commander-in-chief. Calls for radical action proliferated, which was increasingly dangerous, as Japan had a long history of authorities excusing political violence if it was spontaneous and the attacker's motives were considered sincere. And as we saw with Chang's assassination, those in power were hesitant to punish bad actors if they claimed patriotic motives or said they acted to protect the emperor and further the national interest.
So all you have to do is blanket it in nationalism, blanket in the idea that it's good for the country. We see some parallels with that even today throughout the world.
In November of 1930, an ultranationalist belonging to an anti-communist group shot and wounded the Minseto prime minister at Tokyo Station, not far from where Hara had been killed. The conservative Sayukai Party then used the wounded prime minister's inability to come into the Diet as pretext for claiming he couldn't govern. The prime minister died the next year. Then in March of 1931, a group of junior officers called the Cherry Blossom Society, so named because they said the life of a soldier was fleeting like a cherry blossom, tried to spark riots that would instigate martial law, paving the way for a coup, but said riots were badly organized and failed. To avoid repercussions, the general, who they'd planned to make prime minister, hushed the incident up, and again, no one was punished.
And again, they've pushed the envelope. This is a little bit more now. They're pushing things. They're testing. This is like a kid, right? Seeing how far they can get away with things with mom and dad. When will mom and dad crack down on me? So far, nobody's pushing back, and they're just going to keep pushing the envelope.
But that was mere prelude to another plot. A rail bombing, just like back in 1928. September 18th, 1931. South Manchuria Railway. Quietly, the lieutenant lays bundles of blasting powder by the train tracks. The plan, devised by a colonel and lieutenant colonel, is this: blow the railway, attract Chinese troops from a nearby barracks, blame the blast on them, and invade in retaliation. He backs off, hears the train coming, and detonates. Unaware, the train speeds toward the damaged area of track, hits it, sways, and continues on, never knowing it passed the epicenter of a new and bloody war. The explosives, it turns out, were too far from the tracks to cause much damage. But that doesn't matter, and the charade goes on. The next day, Japanese artillery fires on the Chinese garrison in retaliation, and 500 soldiers cross into Chinese territory. Suddenly, as planned, Japan is at war. And in Tokyo, the military coup will come within weeks.
Wow. I knew the end of this story. I knew how things kind of happen in the mid-1930s, right? But I didn't know how much of this backstory was going on. So this is really fascinating stuff. And I've loved all the stuff that you guys have been adding to this and, giving additional information. Let's keep that going. I know a lot of you know far more about Japanese history and Chinese history than I do, or many of us do. So let's keep that going. And we'll be back again tomorrow with part 4. Thanks for watching.